Okay, guys, today we get to finish up our unit on existentialism, understanding that it is altogether too truncated, that there's so much more we could say. We could teach a year-long course on many of these subjects and really only scratch the surface. So I'm setting my timer, and I think I've figured out how to decrease the sharpness of the volume of it. Let's see if I'm right. So where we left off last time is we started talking about anxiety, dread, and despair, about how it is that there's a disconnection of being in our world when we are failing to live up to our will to power. And that seems like, as James isn't here, I don't know where he is, but as James put it, so much philosophical mumbo-jumbo or gobbledygook. It's not. One of the things that frustrates me is people tend to get lost in the language of existentialism and not really appreciate or understand the depths of what it is that these thinkers are trying to communicate. So for those of you who are thinking about writing your final paper on existentialism, look up the psychotherapies of Binswanger and Boss. B-O-S-S, Binswanger, B-I-N-S-W-A-N-G-E-R, Binswanger and Boss, and they were quite a team. Now, particularly look on Boss's side. Binswanger was more of the proponent and Boss was more of the brains behind the scenes, but look up both of them. And so I'd like to give a very applied example of the will to power, alienation, and anxiety, dread, and despair. Once upon a time, there was a little girl. And this particular little girl, like many other little girls, was authentically who she was at a very young age. That there was a trust she had, an engagement in the world of being, an engagement in the realm of being, that she was where she was and who she was in a delightfully unfiltered way. Unfortunately, there were those in her life who sought to exploit her trust for their own prurient gratification. And so a couple of these older teenagers, when she was a little girl, groomed her, manipulated her, and began sexually abusing her. And the sexual abuse lasted from the age of 8 until she was 12, when she began to learn about sexualities from her friends who were starting to get boyfriends. And then she saw with horror and shock how it was that these older relatives had been abusing her. She was not aware of that when she was being abused. And so when I get to meet with her as an adult, I am confronted with a lovely paradox. That as she goes through her life, that authenticity of being, that trust for being, that aliveness and that vitality is still very much with her. And yet not at the same time. Because at times, she is overwhelmed and flooded, goes frozen and numb, and checks out of her body. And so those who know her and love her often just see her, they call it, let's call this young lady Maddie. Maddie going blank. Oh, Maddie's gone blank again. Meaning that Maddie would just stop, and it's like she would just, it wouldn't like be a hard freeze like in a game of stop and go. Instead, it was just a blankness. Like she wouldn't fall to the ground. It wasn't a seizure, but she would just not be there. Her eyes would be staring into the middle distance. She wouldn't be hearing or interacting with or even sensing what was going on around her. She would be thoroughly checked out of her body. And when she went, wherever it is her psyche went during those checkouts, was just to a place of overwhelming numb. And she would stumble through this numb until something would snap her back into her body again. Well, she had learned that she could take a little bit of control by self-harming. And so by inflicting damage upon the flesh as a way to turn her back into reality. And she didn't feel like she had much control over her body when she would do this. But what she could do is she could just put one hand inside the other, and it took Herculean effort, just took all the effort of her heart, soul, and guts to do this. And she would manage to grab one arm in one hand very slowly and then just start digging her nails in. And that became like, imagine you are stumbling through a gray, misty void that is numbingly cold, and that pain in your arm radiates from that particular spot like a thin, glowing silver cord back into the realm of the living, back into the realm of being more fully. And so that pain would pull her back in. And by the time I met her, she had a lot of crescent-shaped scars. They were faint, but she had a lot of crescent-shaped scars and fresh injuries on her forearms. And so an existential psychotherapist would take this up as the kind of dread and despair associated with a failure of will to power, a failure to live up to one's being or live into one's being. And so a lot of therapists get rankled when they hear failure to live up to the will to power. And they go, how dare you blame Maddie? How dare you blame the victim? She was groomed. The trauma of her realization of the abuse, as well as the abuse itself, is causing this particular dissociation. How dare you say she's failing to live up to the will to power? And an existential psychotherapist doesn't see it that way. They're not blaming Maddie. You're just sitting back and going, you're failing. And that's why you dissociate. There's your problem right there. You're just failing. That's not at all what they do. There are reasons why this is a mighty struggle for her. There are reasons why this is extremely tough. There are reasons why other people, her abusers, are deeply implicated in severing her from her will to power. It's not just something that she just chooses to do. Instead, it's a very contextual, agentic thought that it makes sense that a little girl with this particular trauma, given the assaults on her flesh, learned to check out of her flesh. It makes perfect sense that dissociation from being sometimes allows us to survive, even though it changes and truncates what our being can become. And so part of what an existential therapist is going to do in the face of such trauma is help the client relive the trauma. They are going to dissect in a very caring way with the client what the trauma was, what it means, what it implies, what's going to happen going forward, that they get into this particular trauma. And then they will very much help empower the client. That the client might need help succeeding in exercising her or his, or in this case hers, as Maddie's, is in succeeding in her grasping her will to power, in changing the meaning of her life, of not living as a victim, of learning how to stay checked into the flesh during the time she's triggered, rather than checking out of the flesh. And an existential therapist, unlike other therapists, knows the huge sacrifice that she is asking her client to take up. That to face the trauma of being takes no end of courage, and much more so for those who have been traumatized, those who have suffered the atrocities of war, the atrocities of genocide, the atrocity of sexual abuse, the atrocity of spiritual, emotional abuse, the atrocity of physical abuse, that you're asking them a lot to step into being, having a will to power to be who you are, to face your anxiety, dread, and despair, and to take up the mantle of one's own being, to exercise that responsibility when so many traumatic times in your life it has been beaten out of you and broken down and robbed and taken away. And so the existential therapist is going to be the one that is going to walk into those cold, numbing, windy depths of somebody else's trauma to see the validity of that glowing silver cord of what self-mutilation or binging and purging or addiction or other things might mean, to help them ground themselves into that tenuous thread of living. And they are going to follow that thread back into life with the client. And they are going to help the client not need to go back to those depths by living in the face of their triggers, by living in the face of shame, by living in the face of depression, of despair, and helping them find the courage within that pain to continue to live without checking out of living. So it intrigues and frustrates me that existential theory is seen as a therapist in a nice suit sitting in a room, overstuffed leather chairs, just waxing philosophical at super intelligent clients, and that's what it takes to be an existential therapist. And the answer is quite the contrary. Some of the best existential therapists I've known work with the severely mentally ill and the intellectually disabled. An existentialist, you don't need to have clients with very high IQs and advanced vocabularies to do this very successfully or very meaningfully. And in fact, my colleagues who work with the intellectually disabled argue that existential therapy is probably the best way to interact with them, because they have an appreciation, a deep and profound appreciation for the being of their clients. And they are very much willing to explore the boundaries of what their clients can do, rather than so many other therapists who are only interested in what the clients can't do. So years ago, it was a blessing. I got to work as a coach for an Olympics team, a Special Olympics team. And this has been many years ago. And so there I am. I'm not terribly dexterous, I'm not terribly flexible, but working with intellectually disabled teenagers and young adults and helping them learn floor routines and basic things like that. And I didn't know the first things about them, so I had to find out what I didn't know in order to teach them what I just learned. And one of the coaches that I worked with, although he wasn't a licensed therapist by any means, he did have a degree in counseling, and he had very much read a lot of these philosophies, and he very much lived them. That as he's working with these kids, he's not sitting back having deep intellectual conversations with them, but he sees the ways in which they are unfoldings into the world, that they are becomings rather than static beings. And he was the first one to find out what it is they could do rather than looking at the limitations of what they couldn't. And at the same time, though, confronting the limitations of could not, and wondered about how could not could be changed into could by matter of degree. That it wasn't a matter of disability for him, it was a matter of abilities and how it is that abilities vary. One of our boys, I'll call him Lonnie, did not look remarkable. He didn't stand out in any way. His IQ was probably about 50, wasn't really able to read or write. Withdrawn, cold is the way he came across. In actuality, he just didn't know how to relate to the world. But boy, when you gave him heavy weight, he could get it off the ground in a much more powerful manner than his small frame would indicate, that he was shockingly strong for his size. And so this was the first coach to say, okay, this little boy Lonnie isn't able to take our direction in terms of doing a sophisticated floor program. Let's see how much weight he can lift. And then you refer him over to the Special Olympics people who handled weights. And Lonnie ended up placing a bronze that year. There's a mighty and deep and profound appreciation for the capacities of other people in existential theories, as well as some of the others, like obviously Christian therapies, Buddhist therapies, existential therapies, and we'll get to Gestalt therapies, but there's this profound appreciation for that. They're not going to be going into, say, a treatment clinic to work with autistic kids and apply their behavioral analysis to mold the autistic kids to fit into a neurotypical preference for behavior. Instead, what they're going to do is they are going to learn the techniques of applied behavior analysis, but they are going to use them very selectively and only when required. What they are going to do is go in and relate to those kids. They are going to look at the ways in which those kids are human and the ways in which they are talented, and they are going to address and work with the kids in that way. And so I've noticed that my colleagues tend not to last long in those kinds of circles, because their other colleagues just want, okay, just take these autistic kids and then do these punishments and reinforcements on them to get them to act in a way that is more comfortable for neurotypicals. An existential therapist is going to also work with neurotypicals and try to help them interact more comfortably with autistic kids. And they'll see that the damage that you're doing by just trying to warp autistic kids to behave in a way that neurotypicals are comfortable with is problematic. That they're also going to want to have a meeting of being, that here's the beings of neurotypicals, here's the beings of autistic kids, and because autistic kids lack power, the neurotypicals use their applied behavioral analysis to punish and reinforce these autistic kids into behaving and conforming in a way that the neurotypicals will find more comfortable. An existentialist is going to go in there, and yeah, there's some skills probably that the autistic kids may need to learn, but at the same time, though, there are also skills that maybe the neurotypicals need to learn so that they can have a better relationship, that they can both have a deeper and greater appreciation of the being of the other. And so, unfortunately, then, I've known several of my colleagues who've gotten punished out of that world because the neurotypicals don't want to change. They want to exercise their will to power to force the autistic kids to change in a way that the neurotypicals find more comfortable. And so those of you who know me personally know I am very fired up about this and the damage applied behavior analysts did to my own autistic son. So yes, they helped him conform in a way that other neurotypicals found more comfortable for him to be around, but they destroyed his soul in doing so. And I'm having a hard time forgiving them, as forgiving as I am. So when we're looking at anxiety, dread, and despair, and we're thinking of it existentially, it's not blame. When they say failure to live up to one's will to power, and hence you're living an alienated or inauthentic life, there are reasons, and a huge part of existential therapy is meaning and finding out why things mean what they do to the client. How does the client experience his life? A couple of people have pointed out to me by email that there's these really strong similarities between Alfred Adler's fundamental assumptions and the existential therapist's fundamental assumptions. Like Adler is just a very communitarian, very kind of applied coaching style existentialist. And that's a pretty good observation. And so there are some ways in which psychological existentialists are far more individualistic and relativistic than Adler. They work the same philosophy in a different direction. Whereas Adler has these same assumptions and pushes us deeper into the being in relation with others and the compassion and bravery and courage that requires, whereas some existentialists then use it to dissociate us from other people. And we'll get to that more in a minute. But not all existentialists do or have to. So there are when we are confronting anxiety, dread, and despair with other people, it's helpful to keep in mind the notion of the absurd, or just absurd. And there are two. Absurdity is a double-edged sword in existential theory. There's the positive edge to this sword, and that is we have to believe that something is true in order to have rational reasons for doing and thinking the way we do. So we need to think that life has meaning, we need to think that life has purpose, we need to think that some things are true in order to have the courage to go forth and live life, in order to exercise our will to power. That even if I just believe in me, then I'm believing in something in order to do these other things. So one of the things, though, is some of these psychological existentialists go, is anything really true, though? Because everything is subjective and relative. Our adherence to any form of truth, even self-confidence, is ultimately absurd. But we have to do it in order to move ahead. Now, there's absurd put negatively, and that is, human life in existence is itself absurd. When you die, that represents the destruction of the highest object of nature, the highest pinnacle of nature's design, which is you. All of your life projects, all of your life tasks come crashing to a halt with your death. That there are all of your agendas, your intuitions, all of your relationships, as far as you're concerned, end when you die. And so therefore, all of this stress and all of this anxiety you have about whether or not you're going to ask that person out, what that bitch meant on that Facebook post, the politics at work, all of that is ultimately absurd because you will die. And when you die, all of these petty concerns of living die with you. See, that's when you encounter those group of existentialists who sit and they've got their black berets and their clove cigarettes and their goth poetry, And they're like, oh, it's all absurd, and what's the point? And I may as well just try for the sake of trying, even though that I know that trying is ironic. Not all existentialists are down with this. In fact, there are others who are more informed by old school, more Kierkegaardian existentialist thinking, who go, it's possible for us to have a sense of humor about some of our stresses and trials. Doesn't mean that the sense of humor is mockery at all, although sarcasm, especially dark humor, can sometimes help. There's an appreciation, a sensitivity to the absurdity of what we go through. Have you ever had that moment where you're listening to a friend complain and part of you is aware that, wow, this is a really petty-ass problem. This is really absurd. At the same time, though, he's really upset, and he's genuinely upset. And then you use that to reflect upon how absurd it is that you get so upset about similar problems. And so some of the more old school existentialists would say absurdity isn't about, oh, you'll all die and everything dies with you, so why be stressed out now? Instead, it's, look at the ironies. Look at the ways in which this is, the situation's actually pretty funny. You'll find that, and I found this a lot, I've worked in very hard places. Mental health hospitals, clinics specializing in treating the trauma of refugees from war-torn countries, super maximum security prisons, right now working in the addictions field at night. There's a certain dark humor where the therapists begin to have an appreciation of how absurd it all is. The war on drugs, for example, is absurd. I saw this lovely newspaper headline that said, well, after years of engaging in this war, we're ashamed to admit on the war on drugs, we'd like to congratulate drugs won. And it was much more eloquently put in the headlines, but that the rates of drug use and abuse have only gone up in this country. The more and more money we spend on fighting drugs, the more and more we're just incarcerating our own people, and it's doing nothing to actually slow the drug trade or drug use. And there's an absurdity there, a wondering about what it is maybe we could do differently. So there's a comedian named Russell Brand, and he has this very eloquent piece in on his book. He touches deeply on addiction and his own struggles with sobriety there in that particular book. But he talks about, you want a war on drugs? Have a war on abuse. Have a war on trauma. Have a war on poverty. Have a war on despair. That's your war on drugs. And he couldn't be more right. As different as he and I are on various points of view, he's hitting the nail on the head that our war on drugs is absurd. So one of the things that the existentialists tend to do, and you know that you've got them in your clinic when they're the ones who zoom out about what you all are doing and what you're all freaking out about, and they're the ones who find humor in it. Often dark humor, but they see the whole context of what's going on, and then they begin to ask, what can we do differently? Whereas many other therapists want inside-the-box thinking. They want first and second dimensional thinking. Existential thinkers can't do that. They're very much locked in a third and fourth dimensional world where nothing is ever as simple as this client's an addict and here's the program we do for addicts. Instead, they're going to wonder, why is this person addicted in this way, and how do we modify our program to fit this person's need? So one of the things that, again, some of these thinkers, they contradict themselves. I find that mainstream existential theory is not mainstream in psychology, but those who tried to mainstream existential philosophy into psychology contradict themselves, because the world, as you can see in the notes, the world is a structure of meaningful relationships in which a person exists and in the design of which he or she participates. Okay? Because we are part of the world, we are always already constituting the world, and the world is always already constituting us. We are beings in the world with other people and alongside things. Bonus point right now, if you know which epistemology that is. Okay? We are part of the world, and it is a part of us in an inseparable way. So there are three ways of talking about this world in which we are being. In fact, in your chapter, the authors break it down, and I'm going to kind of go over what the author said, and then I'm going to talk about how the text kind of misrepresents what's going on in existential psychotherapy. So if you remember from your readings, there are three types of world. There's Umwelt, which is the objective world. It is the world of objects, the world of nature, the world of physics, the world of chemistry, biochemistry, neurochemistry. This is the world that we belong to, that we must adjust to. The natural environment around us, the natural environment that also constitutes us, the flora and fauna of our guts, our neurochemistry, our neural connections. We all are biological beings, we all have genes and hormones and hunger, we all need to breathe if we wish to live. We will all live and we will all die. That's an Umwelt fact, that nothing is immortal in this world, and this world is very transient. Those are aspects of being that we must deal with, we must adjust to. It's the part of us that feels somewhat deterministic in some ways, that we need to take those into consideration. But understand that it is a finite and limited part of our being that doesn't constitute the whole. If I have the flu, for example, that is going to inform my behavior in ways I cannot choose that it not inform my behavior. The flu will have certain effects on how it is that I think, feel, and behave. At the same time, though, it has an effect, meaning that there's parts about having flu symptoms there's nothing I can do about, but there are things I can do. I can have the flu symptoms and force myself to go to work and work in a terrible fashion because I have the flu, and then also risk getting other people sick. Or I can acknowledge that I have flu symptoms, exercise what knowledge I have about how to treat those symptoms and how to let the disease run its course, and do that instead. That it's something you have to deal with. Likewise, some of us are more biologically prone to certain forms of chronic illnesses, mental, physical, and both, because from an existential frame, they're always already both. So the illness is something that you adjust to, you live around, you live with. It does not determine all aspects of your being, including what the illness itself means. So the Umwelt, so we've got Umwelt, and now I'm going to move on to Eigenwelt. I wish we were here to talk about this in person, but this is our own world. This is our world of self-relatedness, self-awareness. It is the for-me-ness of reality, that this is what I am seeing, this is what I am experiencing, this is my Eigenwelt. When I experience my body, as from within my subjective point of view. When I am experiencing this room, it is from my subjective point of view. Now, this Eigenwelt is a world of subjectivity. And it is very much, it has the potential for radical intentionality, meaning that this subjective world is not the world that I have to adjust or deal with, like my aching back or, my foggy neurochemistry today. I'm very tired. That's not what I have to adjust with. Instead, it is the part of the world that I am most deeply in relation to, and in a manner of speaking, the one I am most intimately in control of. So because of that, in various mainstream psychological theories, and I know I save those for last because they're all common. CBT is so common, just behaviorism. They're the foundations of our perception psychology classes and our learning psychology classes and our cognitive psychology classes. I don't really cover those in depth here because they're so widely covered elsewhere. In those models, though, love doesn't make sense. Like, how many articles do we see that can pass muster on the psychology of love? And the answer is very few. You would think that the near universal experience of love for spouse or lover, love for children, love for parent, love for friend, love for being itself, that there would be lots and lots of articles on love. There just aren't. You'd think it would be the most commonly studied topic, and instead it doesn't make sense in a scientific model and in a scientific world. So instead what we have is a lot of operationalizations of love rather than appreciation for love itself. James, I'm judging you with my eyes. So I've got to tease James for a second. So in existential theory, we have a model of love wherein people can intend their meaning and their feeling of love for another. That that when they feel love, that it is a part of their world that colors their whole world, and this part of world is the Eigenwelt, and then if they act on that love or speak to that love, the Miltwelt, okay? That there's a that this is part of the world, and it is a very important part of the world. And so when I say intentionality, that when we're having the experience of loving, it is something that we can take up mindfully, deliberately, we can live out, we can push into. How many human tragedies involve the feeling of love, and how many of our greatest triumphs involve the same feeling? So, just as a little aside, but one of the bridges between the Eigenwelt and the Miltwelt is our love for being, and love for others who are our co-beings of being. So they're being with us. And this other world, the social world, is called the Miltwelt. This is our being with one another, the world of social engagement, social understanding, and social contact. It is the world of relationships, culture, language, the world of words, touch, conversation, right? This is the world of other people and how we care for and relate to them or interact with them, even if in an uncaring way. So one of the things that I was a little bit worried about in reading this chapter is there can be a misinterpretation that you have the Umwelt, the Eigenwelt, and the Miltwelt, and those are three separate worlds. No, they are simultaneous worlds. And so don't think of them as three separate worlds so much as three different frequencies of the same world. And they're three frequencies that are always already affecting one another. So who I am and my subjective take on things very much informs my body, for example, that if I get a text message and I interpret the text message in a way that stresses me out, then my body is already responding to that stress. It's not that I interpret it and then the body responds. It's that the interpretation and the bodily reaction are part of the same part of it. And who's also simultaneously a part of it is the person who sent the text, because they're a part of why it is that I interpret the text this particular way. So yesterday, for example, I was meeting with one of my supervisees, and she had sent an email earlier in the week about the closing of her internship with us, her practicum with us, at the end of the semester. And this is a student who had expressed and committed to participate in our practicum program at the clinic, and then went dark on us, stopped responding to emails, stopped responding to requests to schedule and what her schedule would be, and then she shows up on the first day of class ready to engage after we had set up all the other schedules, etc. So therefore we kind of had to shift things around in a frantic fashion to try to fit her in. When she went dark, we had to make plans going ahead because there are other interns involved, there are other employees involved, and they needed to know what their schedule was because of their various other demands. And so she sent an email that came across as, during the summer, so I'm done at the end of this particular semester, and over the summer, if you guys need me to, I'll come and help out, but I can only come and help out in a very limited way, and here's the very limited hours that I'm willing to work in a limited way. And so, bye. And that's the way the email read. And I went, oh, okay. Well, I'm going to miss this particular student. I have a very high opinion of her, and I'm going to be glad to be done because the way in which she asks us to bend heaven and earth for her. And so, in supervision yesterday, she asks me, she says, okay, so when am I working over the summer? You know, what are the hours? And I looked at her and said, wait, you're done at the end of the semester. You're done in here in just a few weeks. And she goes, no, I was asking very much if I could stay on. I have another practicum aligned, but this place means so much to me, I want to stay. And I went, oh, well, we didn't even write you into the next schedule because we thought that you were done. And so seeing the simultaneous reaction on her, it wasn't that she was processing through and then how she was interpreting it, then through space and time caused a bodily reaction that the Miltwelt of our relationship informed her subjectivity of her Eigenwelt, her for-me-ness, and then that created a reaction in her body. No. The Miltwelt, our social relationship, is already involving my subjectivity and hers at the same time, as well as our bodily reactions. So within a few minutes, I have a sobbing practicum student in my office because that's not at all what she meant. And she wondered how in the world, and she wasn't accusatory, she was very sweet about this, but she genuinely wondered about how I came to interpret her email the way I did. And my response was, okay, here's my history with you. Here's how you started this particular practicum. You have been very clear about your limited hours, and that you seem to hold a dozen other priorities above your practicum experience here. And so therefore we have only been able to utilize you in very limited ways. And like, for example, the same student was observing, worried that she was not getting enough relational hours for her marriage and family therapy program. And she's not, she's getting very few. But another colleague of hers is, for the same number of hours worked, has more than double the number of relational hours that the other practicum student does per number of hours worked. Now he works more hours, so of course he has even then more relational hours. And so I'm putting it back on her going, well, if I break his schedule in half and the number of relational hours he has in half, because he's here for double the number of hours, he still has far more relational hours than you do. And so it was a very tense, very difficult conversation. And it was meaningful because she's upset and crying, and I am concerned about her, and all of this is going on at once. Our social relationship, my embodied experience, her embodied experience, our subjective experience of what is going on is all happening simultaneously. And so what an existential therapist does is they are wondering about, how is the body a part of this? How is neurochemistry, neurobiology, how is this a part of what's going on? How is their subjective interpretation of what's going on in their world and with themselves a part of what's going on? And what's going on in their social world that is a part of their experience, all at once. And so it's a very fourth dimensional kind of construct where you have my subjective interpretation, my body, and my social relationships are all a part of what's going on with me all at once. And so the existentialists are trying to break it down in a way to challenge their students and challenge the readers to begin to think about being in this layered way, rather than just, oh, it's just your subjective interpretation and that's what we need to work on. No, the physical reality of your body and the physical world matters. Oh, it's just all your social relationships. No, your subjective interpretation matters. Oh, it's all just your biology. No, your subjectivity and social relationships still matter. So they are trying to encourage us to look at it simultaneously. So how much time do I have? Do I have time to go on a rant about time? I don't think I do. Shoot. Okay. So,
You've gone a mini tangent.
Yeah, okay. It's a big one, and it's one I'm very excited about. So thank you for being my devil today, James. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay. So one of the things that existential thinkers are doing, and the Gestalt thinkers, the Christians and Buddhists were already there, but the existential thinkers and the Gestalt thinkers are trying to free us from clock time. To make this very long tangent very short, where does your past exist? Well, it exists in memory, right? Mm-hmm. Where does the future exist? In your intention, right? Mm-hmm. And so the future exists right now in your intentions for the future. Your past exists right now in your memory for the future. So therefore, really there's no such thing as past, and there's really no such thing as future. All we have is the present. And so that comes out of Kierkegaard's observations that in Scripture, God experiences time as rolled out before him like one eternal scroll. That God lives in the absolute present with us. God doesn't know your future. God doesn't know your past. What God knows is everything all at once right now. He knows you, and he knows you very intimately and well. And so what it does is it changes many of the questions we ask. Like, Sometimes I'll have frustrated students in my office wanting to debate about religion, and they'll say something of, well, if I'm going to whichever kingdom of glory, celestial, terrestrial, telestial, or whatever hell, or whatever else, why am I going through this given that I'm just going to end up there anyway? God already knows that God is omniscient. And the answer is no, you're not looking at it the way God does. Everything is right now. The hells that you experience, the heavens you experience, all of that God is also experiencing all right now, that God is an omnipresent entity. We keep emphasizing omniscience, or we keep emphasizing omnipotence, but what we keep not emphasizing in our very linear-minded culture is omnipresence. God is all when, all at once. And so it solves many of the problems because you too are all when, but not all at once. So you are not omnipresent, you are not omnitemporal. Instead, you are a much more finite version of the infinite. However, you are all right now, that this is your being. And science tells us that cause and effect happens through time. These thinkers say, no, cause and effect can happen all at once, and often does, in an immeasurable way. So I would tell stories and examples, and we'd break it down and rap about it, but we're getting short on time today, and this is the last day I have budgeted for this particular conversation. So Binswanger and Voss, and then later Irvin Yalom, break down some other issues. So you're sensitive to your client's will to power, their various worlds, the anxiety, dread, and despair, how to empower them and help them unfold into the world more authentically. Like, that's on the table. That's something you're concerned about. But they also break down death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness as possible additional sources of concern. And this is not an exhaustive list. We don't have time to have an exhaustive list, especially because every client helps us write a new list. So this is more secular, very individualistic, more relativistic in outset, and then I'm going to critique it. So death. Death is a fundamental part of being, and the existentialists argue we live in denial of it. Our death is the end of everything we are and everything we could have been. So because death is so terrifying, we erect defenses. A big defense is to deny that we even fear death. They say everybody does. So they even bring up various personality disorders, narcissism, for example, histrionic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, not antisocial, but histrionic and narcissistic, for example, are ways to push against death by forcing one's being. Like, as a narcissist, I'm all into myself. Or as a histrionic, it's all about the attention I get from other people, that it's a way to feel alive, to deny the power of death that's coming for us. And so one of the things that I really enjoy, and I'd like to point this out to you, how often do people say, see you later, when what they should be saying is goodbye? But that's an example of our fear of death. That people will say, oh, see you later. No, it's goodbye. You're never going to see these people again. Why are you using see you later when you ain't going to see them later? Okay? So that's just a mini example of our neuroses around death and endings. Because goodbye demonstrates the death of a relationship. So freedom. Human beings are free to live into the world in the face of whatever constraints they have, and to magnify what possibilities they also have. So there are some existentialists who even take it into free will, that in the Eigenwelt, in your own subjective world, that is where you have radical free will, that you can choose how you feel in relation to your body, you can choose how you feel in relation to your social world, the Umwelt and the Miltwelt in particular. Others are much more temperate and say, no, you are free to do what it is that the constraints of life give you. Like, I'm not free to long jump, I'm just not built for it. But I am free to lift weights, and I am built for that. So there's some tension there within existential theorists. So regardless, they argue that freedom is terrifying because we need structure in life, a reason to be, and there's nothing authentic out there in the world that will give that structure to us. And so we are forced to give ourselves structure and meaning, and that's what we're free to do. Because we are radically free, we are also radically responsible. And so if you are more tempered in this, if you are more tempered in your freedom, then you might see the role in which your world has something to do or say about your freedom, but at the same time, to embrace what freedoms you do have. So, you don't blame your feelings on someone else. Acknowledge how it is that they're a part of what you're feeling, but don't blame it on them. That you also have a role in how it is that you feel. One of the things that I've noticed they're very good at in the addictions world is they try to slap the pointing finger. Well, you make me feel this way. You've done this, you've done that. And they try to slap that and go back, well, what's your responsibility and how it is that you feel? And that's very existential. So, one of the things that some of the early existential therapists wrote about is that they thought that maybe schizophrenia was an overwhelm at the terrible threat of the freedom of existence, and therefore the overwhelming responsibility to be, that it breaks some people's minds, that they jettison their capacity for responsibility and retreat into symptoms. So there's another way to take up responsibility that is less blamey, and that is, what choices can my psychotic patients make and which ones can't they? And to what degree, rather than black and white thinking, can or can't. What are decisions they're more constrained from making, and what are some possibilities they're more free to make? So part of responsibility is exercising willingness, to be willing to move forward, to be willing to acknowledge one's responsibility to act, whether it's a thinking action, a relational action, a motor action, to see that we can change and take steps to change in the face of a terrifying reality. And so some people retreat into their symptoms of suffering rather than face and exercise willingness. Like this morning, I did not want to get out of bed. My body and soul felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. And it was all I could do to roll out of bed and get on the treadmill to exercise that particular willingness. It was very painful. So one of the things that are very sympathetic for these same authors is that some people's suffering is so great that they lose the ability to even wish for change. And so that's the person who has been hospitalized in an inpatient form for a long period of time, where there's no motion, there's no activity in terms of well-being. So then they also play with freedom with impulsivity and compulsivity. So impulsivity and compulsivity, they see both of them as an issue with freedom. Impulsivity avoids freedom by failing to discriminate amongst options, just doing them all. And so they call it wishes, and this is informed by Freud's old language about id wishes, right? That here are all of these possibilities, so I just try to do it all at once. And it's a disorganized way, and it's really hard to create change when I'm just doing anything that I feel like when I feel like it, because then I'm scattered and moving in multiple directions at once. Compulsivity is characterized by not acting proactively. Instead, you are trapped by internal standards for your behavior, and therefore you're not exercising freedom because you have created a jail for yourself and you've forgotten that you have the key to get out. So when it comes to exercising our responsibility, one of the things they challenge us to do is to look at the decisions, and it's a capital D decision. Like they even sometimes write about it with a capital D decision. When faced with the reality of a wish, of a desire, and once the wish is felt, then you're faced with a decision. You can either choose to act on the wish, or you can choose to do nothing. But the second the wish is known, a choice is made. You may try to abdicate the responsibility and have somebody else choose for you, because it can create a great deal of anxiety to decide. There are a lot of little things we make, like chocolate versus vanilla ice cream or Rockwell. They're not going to say that's a capital D decision. Instead, sometimes getting out of bed is a capital D decision. How we talk to a friend is a capital D decision. How, like for my clients with eating disorders, as strange as this may sound, whether or not to eat that sandwich, as it's not a capital D decision for me, it is a capital D decision for them. It takes effort and will to try to eat healthy. So one of the things you need to do as an existential therapist is acknowledge and appreciate when there are capital D decisions. And they're usually about one's health and usually about one's being in the world and in relation. So freedom, impulsivity, compulsivity, responsibility, capital D decisions, all of that is going on all at once. So isolation. Isolation is some argue that that is the reality that we are in. I cannot share a consciousness with you. So I'll experiment on James. James, what am I thinking?
About tacos.
Damn it. Okay, so James knows me pretty well.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah. So let's try a different experiment. Okay, what am I thinking of now?
Pork?
No.
No.
See, good guess though, because that is something I might actually typically think of. No, I'm debating on whether or not to trade in my 2018 Kia Stinger for the 2020 Kia Stinger. Okay.
That is far away.
Yeah.
Far off. Yeah.
So yeah, you're a little ways away. I'm sure we can make the connections, but so that demonstrates that my consciousness is an isolate consciousness. At the same time, though, it also demonstrates a criticism for this belief in radical isolation. People can get to know us pretty well, and although our subjectivities can't overlap, we can have an attunement to and a deep appreciation for other people's subjectivity. So I'm going to be a little over time, folks, because it's the end of the unit. Bear with me. So with isolation, they argue that only when we face the intensity of isolation, the way in which we can't really overlap consciousnesses with others, where we can't really share identity with others, by facing that and appreciating it, we can actually have more authentic relationships. And they point out that many codependent disorders, as well as some personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, are in part due to the existential terror of isolation. That I latch my identity onto somebody else, and that they then constitute who I am and how I feel. So therefore I never have to feel isolate because I engage in this neurotic illusion that other people are a part of my feeling. Now, the Christians, and to a degree the Buddhists, say, although isolation is worthy of discussion, we can't overlap consciousnesses. At the same time, though, you're not, because the existential, the black beret, clove cigarette smoking ones are like, you're born alone, you die alone, you know. The Christian existentialists, and sometimes the Buddhist existentialists, say, no, actually, you came out of a womb. There was somebody else there when you were born, and that person went through a hell of a lot to get you here. And they feel a very deep connection to you. And when we look at infants and moms, they seem to have a really good connection. They're not really isolate beings, but interdependent beings. And so therefore we're not really isolate. And most people actually don't die alone. Most people actually die in the presence of other human beings. And so therefore we're not really alone when we die. We're not really alone when we're born. Yes, no one is experiencing birth with me from my point of view, from within my subjective point of view, but they are from their point of view. So we're not really alone. And so therefore they tend to take a little bit of a different disorder where some of these like borderline dynamics or codependency dynamics are actually people having an issue with how it is that they are going to feel connected, how it is they're going to feel attached, and denying their own responsibility to be in relation to another. And so the last one, and I know I'm going through these very quickly in the name of time, is meaninglessness. We construct our own being, our own reality. There are no purposes for being other than the purposes we create. Now, some existentialists say that we individually create. Others say that we create in relation. Under this thin veneer of our subjective experience of meaning is the yawning abyss of meaninglessness, this great black hole, empty pit of meaninglessness. So human beings seem to require meaning contrary to the fact of their existence. So they arbitrarily adopt values to give them a blueprint for life. I'm a Christian, I'm an atheist, I'm vegan, I do CrossFit, like whatever they do in order to give themselves meaning. And so they arbitrarily adopt values that go with that meaning, rather than just facing the fact that life itself is fundamentally meaningless. Now, again, the Christians and Buddhists are thoroughly off the boat here. They argue that life is inherently meaningful, and that what we do is we truncate being by adopting in a hard way these identities. I'm a Christian, I'm atheist, I'm into CrossFit, I'm a vegan, right? Those are ways of truncating the possibilities for being, and therefore you are warping possibilities of meaning. So they don't see it as meaninglessness necessarily as the problem, but what we do with the meanings that we're given. So I hope in this past 3 series I've given you some kind of sense for what it's like to think like an existential therapist and some of the possibilities for being that existential therapists give us. So I will see you next time. James, would you mind closing the camera?